And good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming back. If you're a returning viewer this morning, and if you're not, if you're a new viewer, welcome to Virtual AP US History. We're now in the review phase of things. Of course, yesterday we started with Unit 1, and today we are going to do all of Unit 2. And I know that many of you are paying attention to what is and what isn't on the exam. Of course, Unit 3 is the beginning of the exam material, which will actually begin tomorrow. However, Unit 2 could potentially be a contextualization point, depending on what the DBQ question is. So we're going to get started here with the Unit 2. And really, we're going to do this in 4 segments. And while we get rolling here, of course, just a quick reminder, especially if you're new, we do have a Twitter page at virtualapush, at virtualapush, and you can tweet questions to that. Twitter, Miss Farr, who is my, we're calling each other partners in crime, I guess, will be manning that Twitter page and answering those questions for you as we go through the material. So quick overview of what we're going to do today. There's really 4 pieces. I'm going to kind of skip down to the end here. At the end of the lesson, you should understand these 4 parts of what I'm going to cover today. So the overriding question: how did the colonial era lay the groundwork for the American Revolution, which is the beginning of period 3, which we start first thing tomorrow. So at the end of the lesson, there's really 4 pieces. I sort of divided this into 4 parts for us, and we're going to focus on comparing the goals of European colonists in the New World. That's the first piece. How the British colonial regions were different from one another. The third part of that is the interaction between Europeans and Native Americans in North America. And then finally, the ways the colonies were connected with the mother country. And we'll begin to figure out ways that those bonds begin to weaken, which is really what the subject of tomorrow is. So without further ado, we're going to jump right in here and get on to Unit 2, the colonial period. So part 1, comparison of European empires. I'm going to do this by trying to build an argument with you. So remember, on a DBQ essay, which is what the exam will consist of this year, you have to write an essay that supports a historical argument. So I'm going to make the argument that the British colonies were the most unique of the European empires in the New World. So you'll see I have 7 different facts, 7 different pieces of evidence that are going to help support my argument about the way or the reasons why the British were the most unique or the most different of the European empires in the New World. So let's get started with that. So remember, my argument, my thesis is the British colonies were the most unique or the most different from the European empires or the other European empires in the world. So the first one, the first example here is the English sought to establish colonies based on agriculture, of course, meaning farming. So we have examples like in Virginia where they're growing things like tobacco, and places like South Carolina where they're growing things like rice and eventually later on cotton. The other colonies don't do that. The other colonies are based on other things. So you see here on the left, we have the French and the Dutch, who are basically fur traders, who are using their trade alliances to acquire pelts and to engage in fur trading. They're not really coming for agriculture. They're not settling to create farms, and they're not growing products that are going to be sent back to Europe. That's not what's happening there. And the Spanish, likewise, don't come to establish agriculture either, or base their society, at least initially, around agriculture. Instead, the Spanish were seeking things like gold and silver. They're mining those precious metals. Of course, they're taking them from Native American societies, and Ms. Farr yesterday talked quite a bit, did a nice job with the Spanish empires and the interaction between the Spanish and the Native American people. So again, not really based on agriculture. The English or the British colonies came to establish colonies based on agriculture, unlike the other 2. So that's one way or one reason that the British colonies are the most unique or the most different. A second reason, the English sent large numbers of both men and women to colonies to acquire land and to populate their settlements. So there's large numbers of both genders coming to the British colonies. And you can see the empires here in the map, and you'll see very similar maps to this as we go along the way here. The blue in this case is the French Empire, and the reddish color there is the British Empire, and the orangish color at the bottom there is the Spanish. The French don't bring a whole lot of females here. They're mostly males. They're made up of two different groups. If you're a reader of the American pageant, as my students are, the coureurs de bois, or the runners of the woods, the fur traders, they come mostly male. Jesuit priests, of course, in the Catholic religion, only males can be priests. They were often referred to as the Black Robes by Native American peoples. So it's mostly males coming to the French Empire, or the Blue Empire that you see on the map there. And the Spanish conquistadores, of course, they are mostly male as well. Women in those days, of course, didn't engage in military exploits and come over to the New World in order to take over Indian society. So again, the second reason why the British are the most unique of the four, really three main European empires in the New World, is that they brought both men and women, especially in New England. And we'll talk more about that down the road here. My third reason, the British had relatively, key word there, relatively hostile relationships with American Indians. When we get to the third phase of what we're going to discuss today, we're going to see some examples of Indian wars and conflict between all the different groups here. But the British tended to be more hostile than the others. And of course, this is a judgment statement here, an argument statement that I'm making. The French and the Dutch engaged in trading alliances with Native Americans. They needed to maintain friendly relationships with Native Americans in order for that to happen. And the Spanish wanted to convert the natives to the Catholic religion and or exploit the Native American population here using things like the encomienda system that, again, we talked about, that Ms. Farr talked about a little bit yesterday. So the British were more hostile than that. Some people refer to this as the convert or die philosophy, that the British basically saw American Indians as Native Americans as being in the way and an obstacle to be overcome, and that having a strong relationship with them was not really a high priority for the British. So that's my third reason. Fourth reason, British rarely intermarried with native peoples or Africans and eventually developed a rigid racial hierarchy. And I know my own students struggle with this idea a little bit, this rigid racial hierarchy, because they often think of the image that you see in the lower right corner here. Of course, that colonial class structure, which comes from colonial Spain, looks like it's rigid, and we think of a caste system. But what that statement means about the British is that they believed in not mixing races, that they did not believe in cross-racial unions or marriages. You'll see the other two groups, though, other three groups really, did in fact do that. The French and the Dutch accepted that. The Spanish accepted that, and you can see that especially in that little chart that you see here, that there's a mix of, for example, mestizos have a Spanish parent and a Native American parent, or other groups like that, as you can kind of see. So the Spanish did engage in cross racial unions. The French and the Dutch definitely did do that. The British did not. The British saw that as inappropriate, and they that's what makes the Pocahontas story such a unique story, because she's the exception, marrying an Englishman, that really proves the rule. So here's my fourth reason that the British are unique, or the most unique of the empires, very different. Another example, the British colonies had examples of self-government. So what does that mean? The British colonies had some power to make decisions amongst themselves, unlike the other three, really. So the Spanish and the French were really controlled pretty much directly by the king. The Spanish were ruled by a viceroy. Roy is another word for a king, so sort of a vice principal, vice president, viceroy. They did not have a representative assembly. The colonists were not asked their opinion about things. French, basically the same story there. And the Dutch colonies were ruled by a company, by the East India Company. And so imagine if Amazon or Facebook controlled a colony, and they would make decisions. And of course, the CEO makes decisions there. There's not a lot of democratic decision making. The British colonies, hopefully you can think of a couple examples of self-government, and I'm going to ask you to tweet those to @virtualapush. See if you can come up with the examples from Virginia. There's a good example. In fact, there's a great hint on the screen here for you. And New England has a unique version of self-government as well. So feel free to tweet either one of those two to @virtualapush, see if we can get some answers to that question. What are those examples of self-government that we see in the British colonies, unlike the others? British colonies allowed settlers of different ethnic groups. For example, the Scots-Irish that come in the 1700s, the Germans that come and settle, a lot of them settle in Pennsylvania. And we take the word Deutsch, which is the German word for German, and turn that into Dutch. So when you hear about the Pennsylvania Dutch, they're actually Germans, not Dutch. But the Spanish and the French did not allow non-Catholics to settle in the New World. So if you weren't Catholic, you weren't allowed to come to the New World. The Dutch did allow ethnic diversity almost by default in New Amsterdam. In New Amsterdam today we know as New York City, and of course the colony of New York eventually. So if you ever travel around New York City, there's plenty of ethnic diversity there, and we'll talk about that more in a later episode of our series here reviewing the core. So the British colonies did allow settlers of different ethnic groups and also different religious groups, which makes them very unique. In fact, the British sort of have this attitude about allowing the religious dissenters to leave. The Puritans is one example. The Catholics that come to Maryland is another example. The Quakers that come to Pennsylvania is a third example of that. The British were more than willing to allow those groups out of England to come and settle into the New World. This one not as strong as the other reasons, but the English settlements tended to be more compact. You can see here the yellow in this case on this map, kind of huddled along the eastern seaboard here, while the French and the Spanish empires were spread out. At least they look a lot bigger on the map. But if you add that, you take this part of the story, these looks like the Spanish control all this green territory in the southern part of the map there, the lower part of the map, and the French. But when you look at the numbers, and down here at the bottom shows you some of the different numbers that you have here. The British 300,000 people, over 2.5 million people by 1775. The French only have 60,000. So while it looks like this gigantic empire on the map, it really, comparatively speaking, when you look at the population, doesn't really tell you an accurate story there. It's kind of important to put those two things together. And the British colonies very much grew, their populations grew much more quickly than the other two empires there. So that's 7 different reasons. So hopefully I've built an argument enough to persuade you that the British colonies were the most unique of the empires in the New World. So that's our first part here. So let's do a quick exam practice on that. This is an old short answer question from a while ago. And we'll just give you about 40 seconds, 50 seconds to think about, based on what I just reviewed with you here, the 3 different parts of this. Explain one important similarity between the goals of the Spanish and the English. Explain one important difference between the goals of the Spanish and the English. Notice goals, that's an important part of that. And briefly explain one way in which the difference you indicated in B contributed to a difference in the development of their society. So how did that difference lead to different societies? So with this, the timer started here for you. All right, that's about 40 seconds. So hopefully you thought a little bit about those 2 questions. And if you're not watching this in the live window, of course, you can pause the video and think a little bit longer about that. So what's one important similarity between the goals of the Spanish and the English? Well, both of them are looking to acquire wealth. The Spanish are going to if I shout out to Kylie, apparently she gets a free sandwich. So a lot of you are answering House of Burgesses and Mayflower Compact as answers to my question that I asked you to tweet. So awesome job to any of you guys that put that as an answer. And Kylie, enjoy that free sandwich. So So good for you. So similarity, the Spanish and the English are both seeking to acquire wealth. Spanish are looking to get gold in the New World, and eventually, of course, throughout the 1500s, that's what they're doing. The English, when the English, for example, come to settle Virginia, they think they're going to find the same thing that the Spanish did. They think they're going to be able to make all kinds of money off of stealing gold from Native Americans, but they don't really find that. One important difference, and of course, there's lots of possible answers here. I'm just kind of going quickly for the sake of time. So one important difference between the two, the Spanish are definitely more interested in converting natives, where the English, while they will engage in that to some extent, it's not as important as it is for the Spanish. The Spanish, the English have a much wider range of goals that they're seeking here, including creating religious havens is one of the examples, where the Spanish, of course, aren't doing that. And then for C, lots of different answers for that one. The Spanish developed extractive industries in precious metals like gold and silver, where the English were more likely to establish economies based on trade and agriculture, which is one of the things that we talked about. So the different goal led to a different type of society. So that's our first segment. So let's move on here to part 2, British colonial regions. So this section really talks about the different colonial regions. There's 4 different regions I'm going to highlight very quickly here for you. And I apologize that we're going quickly, but this is review of an entire unit in the course, right? So the first region is the Chesapeake, and the best example of this is Virginia. It's probably the one that you studied a long, long time ago. Jamestown is the initial settlement of that colony. It's the first permanent English settlement in the New World. So as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, it's founded by the Virginia Company of London, which is a joint stock company, and they're looking to make money. Profit is their main goal, very similar to the Spanish, as we just mentioned. In Virginia, the charter that was created guaranteed the rights of Englishmen to settlers. And what that meant is that the colonists believed that they weren't going to be treated any different than any citizen or subject in England. And that'll be important in our story tomorrow. They face many obstacles. Of course, there's the starving time, as they referred to it. Native Americans aren't real thrilled about the settlement that ends up settling there. There's starvation. And they have to figure out how to make their way once they realize that they're not going to be able to find gold. And the way that they've kind of solved that is tobacco. And tobacco saves the colony. It becomes the export of the colony. Just to give it a quick example, in 1613, there were 4 whole barrels of tobacco exported. In 1616, 2,300 pounds. Just a year later, 19,000 pounds. And then a couple of years after that, 60,000 pounds. So this really explodes because tobacco, of course, is a nice addictive substance that Europeans desired, and that creates the economy, the basis of the economy in Virginia. In 1619, they created the House of Burgesses, one example of early self-government in the New World. And also in that year, the first slaves were brought to the colony. So you begin to get that that sort of defining characteristic of the United States, that we're democratic and yet we're also a society that has slaves. And how can we resolve those two things? And that answer will come a little bit later in the course. Labor in Virginia, just a quick review. Of course, early on, the main labor source in Virginia was actually indentured servitude. There was a system called the headright system, where if you brought over indentured servants, you actually got additional land. So if you were wealthy, you could become a lot more wealthy as a result of this. Indentured servants eventually expected to be freed at the end of their term, usually 5 to 7 years, assuming that they lived that long. Disease often claimed them before that ended up occurring. And then, of course, that changes towards the late part of the 1600s. And one of the main reasons is Bacon's Rebellion, which is an uprising of former indentured servants. They're angry at the governor, without getting too much into the details here. But that causes people in Virginia to begin looking for other sources of labor. And that other source of labor, of course, becomes African slaves. And we'll talk about that at the end of this segment here, kind of comparing the regions as far as slavery is concerned. Our second region, the Carolinas, a good example here is South Carolina, often tied in with the British West Indies, which you can see in the map here. They, interestingly, are more like the West Indies than they are like the other colonies. especially at the beginning. They exported rice and sugar. They came to rely on African slavery, much like we talked about with Virginia. And it, like Virginia, becomes a society that's controlled by a small number of people, lots of wealth, lots of political power. They controlled the offices in the churches. So aristocratic, much like Virginia, except for a different crop here. And so that will create a little different type of slavery as well, as we'll see down the road. So that's region 2. Region 3 is New England, colonies like Massachusetts Bay, which is the most typical one, starting with Plymouth, which you can see on the right. That was their fort and their meeting house. This is where all their important activities took place. So if you had a junior prom as a Puritan, of course, it would be taking place in that building, your high school dances, your church meetings, your government meetings, and of course, hiding out as a fort. And hopefully you realize I'm joking about the junior prom because the Puritans didn't have those. And of course, they tended to settle in towns, which you see here on the left-hand side. You can see that they're a society that's very tight-knit. They lived close to one another. As we'll see throughout most of New England. So what's the story here? How's it different than the 2 southern colonies? And it's very different. This is settled as a religious haven. They wanted to create what they called a city on a hill, or a religious utopia that they thought could be an example to others in England and ultimately to the rest of the world. They're I think super idealistic that they thought they could pull this off. Imagine if you packed up your family and traveled across the ocean to an unknown land, and because you really believed you could become an example for the rest of the world to emulate. And that's what they end up trying to do here. They believe in Calvinism, predestination, and all the trappings of that idea that God has already decided whether you're going to heaven or hell. No matter what you do in your life. And they engage in other economic activities. Of course, they're still farming. They needed to feed themselves. But they also engaged in fishing, shipbuilding, which becomes sort of the trademark, if you will, of the New England colonies. They had rocky soil, which made it a lot harder for them to do large-scale agriculture. Their climate certainly wasn't conducive to growing things like tobacco and rice. Those of us that live in the Northeast understand the depths of winter. Here in Western New York, it's about 40 degrees today in April. Probably not the most ideal climate for growing that kind of crops. Puritans believed all kinds of things about behavior. And again, without getting into a lot of depth here, Puritanism really unified the people of Massachusetts Bay and the offshoot colonies in New England. And they felt it was really critical to punish sin. That's what you see on the right-hand side here, the stockade, for example. So instead of going to in-school suspension, you might be put in one of these things if you were a teenager. But they believed that punishing sin showed their God that they were serious about what they were doing. They didn't want to pollute their whole experiment by tolerating sin. So Puritanism, religion, and this sort of mission that they believed that they had was really critical to unifying them and to defining who they were as a people. So I often refer to them as being inward directed. They look to their neighbors and to their community to help resolve problems, where people in Virginia often were more externally motivated. They looked outside for more land to be taken over and more economic opportunity. The last region are the middle colonies. And some people refer to these as the most American of the colonies, that these are the colonies that become that look most like what the United States ultimately will become. Fertile soil brought expanses of land. They end up exporting grain, so they're sometimes nicknamed the bread colonies. They're economically diverse. You can see the handful of things that I've listed here on the screen for you to think about. Government between somewhere in between the county system, which you would see in more southern colonies, and the town meeting, which you'd see up in New England. They're more ethnically mixed than other sections. They are more religiously tolerant, and that's one of the things about the Puritans. I forgot to mention that they're not really interested in granting anybody else religious freedom. They wanted their own religious freedom. They weren't real tolerant of others. Pennsylvania, great example of a middle colony that is very tolerant. And of course, Rhode Island would be another one up in New England, but that's not a middle colony. So trying not to confuse you here. Easy for them to obtain land. So, so New York, of course, is a middle colony. It tended to be a little bit more aristocratic. It was originally a Dutch colony that was taken over in 1664 when the Dutch were defeated by the English, and they changed the name of it to New York. A little nod out to my home state there. And Pennsylvania, as I mentioned just a minute ago, tended to be much more of the typical example of a middle colony. So William Penn, who was granted a charter to create a religious haven for Quakers, again, another English religious dissenting group that is welcome to leave England and come to the New World. They have a representative assembly. They don't believe in official state churches, lots of land that's available there for them, etc. And so finally, to wrap up this segment, is slavery in the colony. So slavery, first of all, it's important to know all the British colonies, all 13 of them, participated in the Atlantic slave trade. And there's lots of reasons for that. There's land here in America. There's a growing European demand for colonial goods, especially agricultural goods, and eventually a shortage of indentured servants, especially in the late 1600s. So there's a turn towards using African slaves at that point. In New England, obviously a lot fewer slaves being used there. Interestingly, some slaves in New England actually had rights, rights like holding property and being able to sue and be sued in court. Relatively small number there. Port cities have a significant minority of slaves. Southern plantations, of course, is where you're going to find larger numbers of enslaved workers. So the Chesapeake with tobacco plantations using what's sometimes referred to as the gang system, and then the task system on rice plantations, which tended to be much larger groupings of slaves. So it's different kinds of slavery in different places in the colonies. Okay. And the idea, the notion of chattel slavery is an important part of the story here as well. So the second bullet point here, I kind of talked about already, that there's a strict racial system that this prohibited interracial relationships in the British colonies, of course. And the idea of chattel slavery, think of the word cattle, because that's exactly what it's intended to be like, that if you owned cattle and cattle had offspring, then you would own the offspring as well. And so this is the way that the British defined slavery. So what that meant is the child of a slave mother was always going to be a slave. So you essentially get slavery from cradle to grave, from the beginning of your life, if you're born to a slave mother, to the end of your life. And so slavery sort of is perpetual, is the idea of this. And this will be an issue that, again, we will deal with throughout much of the review segment here until we get to the Civil War, which of course is going to end that a little bit down the road. Africans found many ways to resist the dehumanizing aspects of slavery, and that's an important part of the story here as well. They found ways to maintain parts of their culture, for example, burial rituals that they engaged in, sometimes without the master knowing. They maintained elements of their traditional religion, and they also resisted by doing all kinds of things. I listed a handful of things on the slide here: breaking tools, poisoning their owners, which some people think is the greatest fear that slave owners had, that their slaves were going to poison them. But resisting and, pretending to be sick would be another way that they would resist slavery. And of course, the most radical way or drastic way of resisting slavery is rebellion. And the Stono Rebellion is the largest slave rebellion in the colonial era. And this happens down in South Carolina. And after Stono, the colonies tightened up their slave codes, and you can see the list of things that's here that slaves no longer could do. And generally speaking, slave rebellion was something that slave owners were often paranoid about, especially in the Deep South, where in some places slaves actually outnumbered the white slave owners there. So this would be the most drastic example of resisting slavery. So let's do a little practice on that segment of today. So if this was our prompt as a question, explain the causes of the development of the institution of slavery in the period. So we're wondering, well, why did this happen? All right, so one possible argument is that slavery in the colonies originated from the growing demands for cash crops and the substitution of indentured servants with African slaves in the British North American colonies. So let's just take a look at a couple of examples of documents and see if you could, how you might use that in supporting this argument, much like you'll do on the DBQ. Okay, so take a look at this chart. How might we use this in the question about why slavery grew? All right, and our time's almost up there. So you see in the chart here that we have the servants are the little black dots, and you can see the servant numbers goes down, and you can see the little boxes, that line with the boxes on it is the number of slaves. So hopefully you recognize that starting around 1680, those numbers sort of swap, that you begin to have more slaves than servants at that point. So again, just a review of the review. Tweet your answer to this question. What was the name of the rebellion that caused the change from using indentured servants to using slaves in Virginia? What was the name of that rebellion? See if you remember what we just talked about a few minutes ago. Go ahead and tweet that to @virtualapush. All right, we're going to actually skip over this one just for the sake of time. Take a minute to read through this one and see if you can figure out how this would support the argument about why slavery grew. All right, our time's up there. Shout out to Alan Zhang, who got the answer to my question correct first. So it's the Bacon's Rebellion. From the last slide. So this slide obviously is a law. That's what the chapter number here is, an act declaring slaves within this dominion to be real estate. So the document really proclaims that slaves are property. And so you might connect this with the idea of chattel slavery, that slaves are not viewed as human beings, but they're being viewed as property that can be handed down from generation to generation, which you see sort of in the document here. And we won't spend the time here, but if you take a look, just supporting what I mentioned before, that slavery was different in different regions. So in the North, about 5% of the total population is enslaved. In the upper South, what we would call Virginia, the Chesapeake region, for example, the tobacco region, you might call that, about 36% of people are slaves there. But look in the lower South, in places like South Carolina, 58% enslaved. So slavery, of course, develops in different ways in those different regions. So you might talk about that as well in your essay about why slavery grew. All right, part 3, moving along to Native Americans. So see if you can figure out what the theme is that connects all these things here, and we're having some really interesting shout outs today. So Mike says if I say his teacher's name, Rain Man, he gets extra credit. So hopefully you can cash in on that. So Native wars in Virginia, a good example. The Powhatan War, there's 2 actually wars between the Powhatan Indians, which was the tribe that Pocahontas came from, and the settlers of Virginia. And again, you can see here in the image that there's these are vicious and cruel and brutal. They really focus around issues like land being taken over by the Europeans, and of course the Native Americans are resisting that. And then in the 1660s, the Susquehannock War in 1675. excuse me, I meant to say 1670s, and they're not 1660s. But the Susquehannock War is a war along the frontier between the Susquehannock Indians and settlers of the frontier. And this is the background story of Bacon's Rebellion. These Indians were attacking former indentured servants that lived on the frontier, and it's part of the cause of that rebellion that takes place there in Virginia. In New England, we also have wars between the settlers and the Native Americans, King Philip's War. Of course, Native Americans did not refer to King Philip as King Philip. That's a European name for him. His actual name was Metacom. And so notice the year here. It's the same year as the Susquehannock War, which is sort of intriguing. And again, causes English encroaching on Indian lands. There's a breakdown in trading relationships. Philip didn't like Christianity because he felt that people were being less loyal, natives were being less loyal to him than to the Christian folks that were there. And this turns into the bloodiest war ever in American history. 1 in 10 colonists were killed in the course of that. Again, both sides engage in all kinds of terrible things, including torture, killing women and children, which both sides saw as outside the normal rules of war. So again, you see here, the black dots are all the different English settlements that were attacked. So this is not just an attack on Boston, it's an attack really throughout the New England region. And at one point, the war was going so badly for the New England colonists, they actually considered abandoning New England altogether. But again, the tide gets turned against them. I kind of talked through most of those already. Eventually, Philip is decapitated. The collection of tribes that was working with Philip begins to break apart. They capture Philip and they cut his head off and they display it in the central area of Plymouth, just to kind of remind Native Americans about what their fate is if they resist the Europeans, is probably a big part of the message there. And Philip's son was sold into slavery. So again, a very vicious war between the colonists, the English colonists here in New England, and Native American peoples. And a lot of these things focused around misunderstandings of one another. There's cultural problems. For example, the Puritans didn't understand why Native American women often were the ones that were doing the farming. And because when they would experience that, they thought that the Native American people were mistreating them. And of course, the Indians thought that the Puritans were being too, they babied their wives too much because they didn't do the agricultural work. So there's a cultural misunderstanding between the two. There's also a misunderstanding about land ownership. Natives don't have the sense of private land ownership that Europeans do. And of course, that causes some of the problems as well. Spanish also experienced a revolt, and the Pueblo Revolt is the most famous of them. Again, notice very similar to the other two time periods here, the Susquehannock War and King Philip's War. But this is the revolt of the Pueblos, and it's notable because it's successful, at least temporarily. So for about 12 years, the native peoples were actually able to drive out the Spanish. And again, notice the causes here. There's misunderstanding and resentment over religion. There's resentment over attempts to control or destroy their culture. The misuse of or abuse of the Native American people by the Spanish is yet another reason here. And so there's a rebellion, and eventually the Spanish are in fact driven out, at least for a little while. In 1692 or so, the Spanish come back and are much more accommodating to natives, and actually, instead of trying to dominate them, they figure out ways to live with them. So again, courted rather than conquered is a good way of sort of describing that. So that's an example of a Spanish rebellion. And we'll talk about the French and wars with Indians. We'll get into that a little bit tomorrow. We'll save that for that. So let's actually skip ahead here to one that's a little bit later here. So let's take a minute just to read through this document. And if you had to source this document, like what's the audience or the point of view or purpose or historical situation of this document? Just give you about 40 seconds to try to figure that out. All right, time's just about up there. So this, I'd like you to think about audience here for a second, because it's a report of the Plymouth colonial officials, and they're sending this report back to England. And here they're describing what happened in King Philip's War. And so I want you to think about how you might report to your parents about something that happened. You might not always tell them the truth in a situation like this. There's this terrible war that breaks out between the Indians and the colonial settlers in New England. And now the colonial officials have to tell the British government about what happened. And so, of course, they're going to blame this all on Philip. Notice that there's no statement in here about the Puritans cattle trampling on Native American cornfields and misunderstandings about trade. None of that stuff is here. Of course, it's all King Philip's fault. So that might be something to think about when you look at a document. How might this be biased? Am I getting the whole story here? And in this case, probably not. At least not the Indian side of the story, certainly. So again, we'll kind of skip through here for the sake of getting finished. So, okay, so part 4, relationship between Britain and the colonies. So we're going to look at the ways that the British colonies were tied more tightly to England during this period, and the roots of how that relationship begins to change. So connection to Britain, the first example, this is the First Great Awakening. This is the religious revival that takes place starting in the 1730s or so. It is a period of religious enthusiasm. And so what's the connection to England? Well, if you look on the right-hand side, you have George Whitefield, who is an English preacher who comes to America, and he is probably the most famous celebrity in America in the 1730s and 1740s. He actually toured the colonies multiple times. Not sure if he sold concert T-shirts, but he probably could have had those existed at the time. And so this is a person that he's an English preacher that comes to the colonies, and he is preaching this new version of religion that many colonists, in fact, probably most colonists, knew at least who he was, knew his name. So some examples here of what happens as a result of this: a democratic sense in religion. One of the things that Whitefield preached is that everyone should have the experience of religion, that it was more important to have your heart open to God as opposed to understanding all the scriptures. And he also challenges religious authority, which will be the beginning of the roots of some elements of the American Revolution, which we'll get to tomorrow. The American version of the American preacher of the First Great Awakening is Jonathan Edwards. And he writes a very, very famous sermon called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, where he talks about how God is holding you over the pit of hell like a spider, and that he should probably drop you into that, but you should be thankful every day that God is not doing that for you, or to you. So you're a sinner and you're in the hands of God, who's really angry about what you did, and it's only because of his mercy and grace that you don't get dropped in. Or as my college professor referred to it, it was getting you into heaven by scaring the hell out of you. Pretty good, I think, description of that speech. So effects of the First Great Awakening, there's lots and lots of things that happen. A democratic spirit in religion that rejects this idea of the elect, which is an old Puritan idea that there is a group that's been chosen to go to heaven and a group that maybe is not chosen to go to heaven, the elect versus the non-elect. It's the first unifying experience in the American colonies, that all Americans, no matter what their economic class, no matter what their race, no matter what region of the country they lived in, they all experienced that. And so many historians point to this as one of the first examples of the colonies beginning to realize that they have something in common with each other that might not be quite the same as what's happening in England. There's lots of different religious groups that grow out of this, as I mentioned up here at the top. The New Lights and the Old Lights. The New Lights were more accepting of this sort of emotionalism in religion, and the Old Lights, of course, were people that didn't really accept this new emotionalism, emotional preaching, and that kind of thing in religion. So you get even splits within the old traditional churches as well. And you can see that in these two images here. So the Anglican Church, which is the official church of England, here you have the minister who would stand up in this pulpit. And of course, that indicates there's a level, right? That the minister is higher than the congregation, literally and figuratively, that they're superior. And England, of course, embraces this idea of uh, stratification in their society. They believe in levels. We're over here, a Baptist church, which would be more of a New Light sort of church. Notice that the minister is not up on an exalted, pulpit here, that they would actually stand on the same level. And there's definitely an intentional meaning of that there is a sense that maybe there isn't so much importance in hierarchy. Second example of connection to Britain is what they often refer to as transatlantic print culture. The point here being, without going through a lot of this in real depth, is that most of the stuff that the colonists were reading came from England, came from Europe, and they would get news. Oftentimes, the early newspapers in the colonies would just simply take news stories and cut and paste them into their own newspapers and reprint them. And so you get a connection with the mother country, because the colonists are reading the news that comes from England. Actually, prior to 1700, they wouldn't even allow colonists to print news. They were afraid of the British government being undermined by that. And that will be an important story later on. And of course, they're also going to begin reading things like Enlightenment tracts, and we'll talk about that in just a second. With that, so the print culture comes from England. It's a transatlantic, right? Cross Atlantic is what that means. So a good example of a unique version of writing, though, or print culture in America is an almanac. And Ben Franklin created an almanac called Poor Richard's Almanack, which is sort of a collection of information. You can see some of the stuff that would have been included in those: medical advice, agricultural information, like when to plant certain things and how to do planting, practical wisdom, and of course, humor. And Ben Franklin was probably one of the most humorous of the founding fathers. And see some of the little quips that he was credited with in Poor Richard's Almanac here at the bottom. Another connection between the mother country and the colonies is mercantilism. Of course, the colonies were tied very closely into that economic system that we called mercantilism. They're producing raw materials for the mother country. They're purchasing manufactured goods back from that mother country, and they had it pretty good in some ways in mercantilism. They knew where they were going to sell their products. They benefited from the protection of the British Navy in the mercantilist system, but there'll be some issues with that, as we'll get into again a little bit tomorrow. So we often refer to this as the triangle trade, mercantilism, and you can see sort of multiple triangles here, sort of going back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean. And the last is the Enlightenment. And so the Enlightenment is an intellectual revolution that happens in Europe, that those ideas begin to come to the colonies, and they will have a huge influence on the revolutionary generation. These are people that believe in natural rights and natural laws. They believe in, they begin to question the idea of divine right of kings, which we'll get into that a little bit with the revolutionary period here. But so these are parts of the things that would have come over to the colonies in that transatlantic print culture and the ideas of the Enlightenment. John Locke is the most important of those, and I'll hit him again, or we'll hit him again, certainly in the Revolution. But again, the idea of natural rights, of life, liberty, and property, that people give up some of their rights in order to have a safe, secure society, and that because people give up their rights to a government, they can also take them back, which is a pretty radical idea for that time period. And the colonists are going to follow that roadmap here to the revolution. They believed that they had rights that were being taken away from them unfairly, and they were going to take those rights back. And we'll get into that again a little bit tomorrow. Montesquieu, another Enlightenment thinker, whose ideas in the spirit of the laws really give us the basis of our Constitution: separation of power, checks and balances, the goal being to prevent autocratic government or one person being too much in charge. And radical Whig ideology, which is connected to that. It's not exactly the same, but the idea here basically is that the stories of English history are stories of resisting control by the king. So you date all the way back to things like the Magna Carta, where they limited the king's power by Parliament, and this is part of the the heritage that the colonists certainly had, that they did not believe the government could just simply do whatever they wanted to, that there was a balance between legislatures and kings, and that they needed to protect their rights against corruption or an increase in power of government. So we'll just do one or two quick examples here. I know we're really running late. So what as a conclusion we can draw regarding the connection between Britain and her colonies from this graph? So what can you tell about the connection here? We don't even have to wait the whole time. Hopefully you notice here that there is a huge increase in goods that are being sent to British North America from England. So that relationship is certainly growing in the time period. For sure. So, and actually we're not going to have time to get into those, and I'll actually hit those a little bit tomorrow. So debrief and summary. So quick review of what we talked about today. I know there's a lot of material. Unit 2 is a biggie. So number 1, goals and patterns of colonization vary between the different empires. Remember, we made the argument about why the British Empire is most unique. Number 2, the British colonies developed into different regions, and we talked about some of the ways that those regions were different. The Chesapeake region, the Deep South region, the New England region, and of course the Middle Colonies region. European nations had varying types of relations with Native Americans, sometimes allies, sometimes enemies. And again, I'm going to hit a little more of that tomorrow with the French and Indian War. And then the colonies were connected to Britain as a part of the Atlantic community, but began drifting away from them. And that's really the basis of our story tomorrow, kind of setting up where we're heading with things. Just a quick reminder, especially if you're new, if you know of anybody that's struggling with the technology, either needing a device or a connection to the internet, if they're having problems with that, please direct them to this website, cb.org/tech. That will help students to get that so you're ready to go for the exam, which is coming up a month from tomorrow, actually. And again, thank you for watching. We hope that you'll join us again tomorrow. I'll be actually, I'm up again tomorrow, so I'll be doing the causes of the revolution, which is the beginning of period 3. So thank you again for tuning in, especially those of you, there's lots of you, I wish I had time to do more shout outs here, that have been tuning in every day, the teachers that have been tuning in and sending us some really great comments. We really appreciate those as well. So a quick practice question for you to think about tomorrow. What are the reasons why the relationship between the colonies, the British colonies, of course, and the mother country began to change in the late 1700s? What would be the things that would cause that relationship to go in a little different direction than the connections that we sort of talked about at the end of the lesson today? So thanks again for sticking with me. I know it's been a long session today here. So thanks again for tuning in. Hopefully we'll see you all again real soon. Have a good day.